mentioned the word vulnerability there. Are we getting better at that, or have we peaked it and are we coming backwards on it?
You're absolutely right that storytelling has become a buzzword, and I think it now means so many different things to different people that the word itself has become almost meaningless. And I think the number one mistake that I see is that we try to achieve behavioural change before we've achieved narrative change.
Yes. You're not doing it for the good of your own self, you're doing it for everybody's good. And if they don't have that real understanding, then you're going to find it very difficult to change the culture.
I often hear this question, do we start at the bottom or do we start at the top? Do we try and achieve this culture change with leaders and hope that it filters down? Or do we start with people at the grassroots?
I think one of the bigger points is ownership. Who is actually owning safety within your business? Very easy to talk to the negatives when it comes to safety, because you have had an event, you've had an accident, you've had a collision, you've had something gone wrong. But if you can actually celebrate the successes of people through reducing those number of events and actually share that message within your teams and the broader, our global team, that does have an impact on people.
All right, welcome to our next episode of The Art of Safety, Leadership, Wisdom and War Stories. We've got a couple of awesome guests today. We've got Daniel McGuigan from PepsiCo and Jehan Casinader, award-winning journalist and storyteller. Welcome to the episode, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Before we get started into the meat of this session, which is about storytelling and how storytelling can play a real role in developing positive safety cultures in workplaces, keen to hear a little bit about yourself, a bit of your background, and maybe what's got you into your pathway from both a safety perspective and from a storytelling perspective. So Daniel, over to you.
Yeah, so I've been in AHS my whole career, so nearly 30 years. I started off with an environmental degree from the University of Salford, and in my first role in a small waste company, I saw that health, safety and environment were very similar in terms of legislation and were likely to come together in a robust way in the future. So I positioned myself where I was able to get into that early on, and fortunately I was correct. My career has then been quite linear, so I've gone through advisory roles, consultancy roles, then into the parcels industry for 10 years, and for the last 7 and a bit years I've been within PepsiCo, initially in the UK operations, but then into a European and now a global role. Awesome. So AHS Director for Fleet Safety, so we've got about 82,000 vehicles around the world that myself, my boss and my colleague are essentially responsible for the strategic direction for the business. Oh,
a bit of scale. All right, and Jehan, tell us about your storytelling journey.
Yeah, my background is in journalism. I grew up watching the TV and thinking of it as this incredible box that sat in the corner of the living room and took me on these amazing journeys around the world. So I grew up wanting to be part of that, wanting to have the opportunity to tell other people's stories. I got into the media in my home country, New Zealand, at a very young age. I worked in television journalism, and really I got an education in so many different sectors and ways of life. I got to travel to every corner of the country. I felt like I ate in every little fish and chip shop and stayed in every motel. And it really gave me a rich understanding of what life is like for many different people from different walks of life. So I did that for many years, and then in my mid-20s I experienced depression, and this happened at the most successful time of my career. I was winning journalism awards and I was covering big events like the Christchurch terror attack, but I was also suicidal. And I did what so many people do, which is put on the mask and show up at work each day and try to meet my obligations. But after a few years of that and trying all of the different tools and the mental health toolbox, as we call it, I realized that strategy was failing. So I took some time out of work. I wrote a book called This Is Not How It Ends, How Rewriting Your Story Can Save Your Life. And I actually went back and interviewed many people that I'd met over the years who'd experienced different forms of adversity in life. And I was trying to understand, what can I learn from them? And what I learnt was kind of what I'd known all along, which is that we have the power to change our own story. And the stories that we tell have a profound impact on our relationships, on our productivity, on how we experience distress and how we see the world. So for the last few years, I've been working with organisations to try and share those messages with them.
Very cool. And if there was ever a day for me hosting this podcast series to have imposter syndrome, it's definitely today. I think we can probably all agree. That's what a cool story. So the first thing I want to explore in our conversation today is to start off with this concept of storytelling, because it feels a bit of a trendy word at the moment. It gets thrown around all the time. So maybe Jehan, to kick us off, like, What do you see as storytelling, and where do you see the relevance of it in the context of safety culture? And then I'm going to get Daniel to look at that in an industrial application from your perspective.
You're absolutely right that storytelling has become a buzzword, and I think it now means so many different things to different people that the word itself has become almost meaningless.
Yeah.
People use the word storytelling to talk about the content that they put on YouTube, their chief executives' updates, the marketing, the branding, the advertising that they do. I mean, to me, storytelling in its purest form is about influence. And there are 4 key elements that make compelling stories. The first is they're about characters. Stories are about real people, what they experience, what their motivations are, and how they deal with what happens in their life journey. The second element is journeys. How does the character get from point A to point B? What happens along the way? The third element is conflict. What are the obstacles, the difficulties, the hurdles, the losses, the wounds that occur along the way? And the fourth element, which is most relevant to safety culture, is jeopardy. What is on the line? What is at stake? And if you've ever been reading a book or you've been sitting in a movie theater and after 45 minutes you've got bored and you've chosen to leave or close the book, it's usually because there's no jeopardy in that story. There's nothing hooking you in. There's nothing that's making you ask yourself, how is this going to turn out and what are the consequences going to be? So what does this look like in an organizational context? What it looks like is if you want to influence health and safety culture, you can use storytelling to influence the people around you. And you can do that by engaging those 4 elements. And on that last point of jeopardy, I think the most important thing is this. When we get it wrong and we don't protect our people, we don't have the right processes, and we don't empower people to speak up, we lose lives, right? People can actually die at work. Yep. So in this area, there is probably no greater justification for the use of storytelling than almost any other business context. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Case made.
Yeah,
case made.
I think you're absolutely right. Everything you said totally resonates. The first bit about it being real for a number of layers, it has to be real for the people you're trying to ask to do something. So they have to understand the why. Why do you want them to do it? That's where you're trying to explain in real terms, and to use real life examples actually helps you to do that. So the storytelling bit comes in to say, we have had this incident with one of your colleagues, the result was X. So you're able to then give them a real situation. You're able to, for them to see and understand, because it is totally real to them. You know, the jeopardy bit then comes in when you say, well, this happened to one of your colleagues. It could happen to you.
Absolutely.
I think most of us in our lives, particularly when we're that bit younger, think I'm invincible. Yep. You know, nothing's going to happen to me. I do mine. Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's behind you, and it's never going to catch you. But unfortunately, it does. And sometimes it's when you get most comfortable in what you're doing, when you have been doing something for a long time, and you get a little complacent. Yep. That's when the jeopardy really ramps up, because you don't believe it's going to happen to you. Yep. I think from a EHS perspective, from a safety perspective, you have to be telling people that it could happen to any of us at any time. And when you use real examples and when you talk to people and you talk to their hearts rather than just their heads, it has a lot more impact, and you're more likely to achieve your objective.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think behavioural change is driven by attitude, values, and beliefs, right? And so, in order to influence those, and some of those are easier to influence than others, there's got to be a compelling belief or something that cuts through to that person, whether it's the jeopardy factor that actually influences them to the point of opening them up to actually recognise that, which then stimulates that outcome, right?
And I think the number one mistake that I see in many of the businesses that I get to speak in and visit is that we try to achieve behavioural change before we've achieved narrative change. Yes. So what I mean by that is we try and change people's behaviour before we change the story that we're telling them. Yep. So when we flip that around and when we present them with an engaging, compelling story, that then facilitates the behavioural changes that we're after. And that is a totally different approach to saying, here are the policies and the procedures and the steps that you need to take, do X, Y, Z, and you'll be fine. So it's really a mind shift for a lot of leaders, I think, who've been used to just going, chunk, here's all the training, here's the standards, here's the stuff that you need to know.
So the strapline of this session is wisdom and war stories. And so there's been some good wisdom there. So I'm keen to get into a few war stories. And if either of you want to open up here, I know speaking earlier, Jehan, you've got a couple that you've got lined up around the power of storytelling for culture change. I'm sure you've got some great material as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it, war stories is possibly a challenging way to put it sometimes because you are dealing with safety events
Yes.
in some. But it doesn't necessarily have to be only about safety events. It can be about cultural change because of organizational change,
Yep.
and that can have a huge impact on safety. So if you're making a major change to an organization, outsourcing to 3PL or whatever it may be that I've gone through in the past, you have to engage the people who are going to be affected by that change. And getting members of that team to actually advocate for that change is a hugely successful way in getting that engagement brought into the rest of the team. There is huge jeopardy, as we talked about, in terms of making significant change, but having an individual who is willing to step up and say, it's going to impact me, but I believe it's the right thing to do, can certainly help you as an organization. From a safety perspective, what we try to do within PepsiCo is we try to get real voices of our people who have been involved in incidents. Yep. To actually then record a message to other people to show the world their story. So
paying it forward type.
Absolutely. We had one gentleman in the US who was involved in a forklift truck incident where he ended up breaking his back and is paralyzed. And he was brave enough with his wife to sit in front of the camera in his wheelchair and tell his colleagues what he had done, which resulted in his own injury.
Wow.
And that is a hugely powerful message because you can see the emotion both within himself and his partner, his wife. And that, when others see it, is a really powerful message.
Yeah, I mean that is very powerful. It makes it so tangible. It makes that jeopardy factor so palpable for people.
And I think what we're trying to do is, first of all, to name and address the existing narrative, the script that we're trying to flip. So in New Zealand, for example, the dominant story around safety culture is a phrase called "she'll be right." So for people who are not from New Zealand, "she'll be right" basically means it's going to be fine. There's no issue here. We have a very laid-back culture. We can be complacent. And that's not just in safety culture. That's an attitude that pervades so many different aspects of Kiwi life. So when you have a dominant narrative that's so deeply entrenched, this idea that I'm willing to hedge my bets, I'm willing to run the risk, it's probably going to be okay, that's a big ship to try and turn around, right? So I think about some of the big events, the big stories that I've covered in New Zealand. One of the major ones was the Pike River disaster, which was an explosion that happened at a coal mine on the west coast of the South Island in 2010, and it killed 29 miners. Many people around the world would have heard about this. It was a huge story for New Zealand at the time. And about 8 years later, I was working on a current affairs program, and one of our producers had tracked down one of the only two survivors of this disaster, Daniel Rockhouse, who had carried his mate through poisonous gas for 2 kilometres to get to the exit of that mine. They were the only two men who survived. Wow. And what our team had discovered was that Daniel had done the unthinkable. He'd gone back to underground coal mining. And we tracked him down to this tiny town called Emerald in Queensland, Australia. And he agreed for me to bring a camera crew over to Australia and go down this coal mine with him. And so I went 2 kilometres down a coal mine, which is not an experience that I recommend. And I said to him, what are you doing? You have PTSD, you have depression, you have anxiety, you lost your brother and 28 of your mates at that explosion 8 years ago. Why would you go back to exactly the same work environment that must be so triggering for you? And it gave Daniel the opportunity to share this incredible story about how he didn't want to be defined by that event, even though it was painful, even though it had caused so much harm and so much loss. And he shared that story with us, and we were able to share that with 500,000 New Zealanders. Now, most of those people obviously don't work in coal mining, but I think the point there is that all of these messages accumulate, right? They build up. So look for opportunities to connect with, you talked earlier about making it real and making it personal. Who are the people in your business or your sector or your industry who might be in a position, as long as they're safe and they've made enough progress in their recovery, etc., to be ambassadors and share some of those stories, because that's what connects with people.
Is there a piece of this in terms of you mentioned the power of that jeopardy factor? Is there a piece of this, like from a safety leadership perspective, around that sort of stakeholder identification piece and working out what is the magnitude of the jeopardy factor for those different stakeholders? Because there could be a particular change that you're trying to drive leadership on, elevate culture, get better board engagement or executive team, whatever it might be. And we know that there's competing demands in businesses, and some leaders are more motivated by, say, commercial performance or by reputational outcomes or by social impact or whatever it may be through those different layers. Do you think that's an important aspect of pulling together what that story needs to be for the different personas involved?
Absolutely. You have to approach different teams, different people in different ways, even different cultures.
Yep.
So obviously as a global organization, we have different viewpoints on safety and different cultural perceptions of safety. What we have to do as the EHS leadership team is to understand what those cultures are and to work within those cultures to help people to understand what we're trying to achieve. Yeah. The business has its overall view on safety, and it has its vision and its mission that it's trying to achieve, but it's making that relevant to individual teams and managers and leaders within those sectors, and whether that be sales, whether that be supply chain, different priorities affect each other. So you have to work together, and you have to get the individual leaders to understand why you want to achieve something. So you do have to have a different approach sometimes, but getting their engagement and involvement is often the first step to that.
Yes.
So they understand why you're trying to achieve. Again, we talked about the why earlier. It's about ensuring that they know why you want to do something. You're not doing it for the good of your own self. You're doing it for everybody's good. And if they don't have that real understanding, then you're going to find it very difficult to change the culture to bring that part of the business along for the ride. Yeah.
So if we frame that around storytelling, we're really talking about audiences, right?
Yes.
And that's a real shift for a lot of leaders. What do you mean I've got an audience? But actually, you don't have one audience. You have multiple audiences within your own business and your wider stakeholder community. So it's thinking about what are the specific needs that each of those audiences have?
Yeah.
What is the diversity across those? And also, where are each of those audiences at in their journey? So another mistake that I see, so I do a lot of work with building and construction organisations. Yep. We know that in New Zealand, construction has one of the highest rates of suicide. Yep. And so often, I think a lot of health and safety messages are pitched at a very base level, which is, okay, we're targeting stereotypically a young apprentice who's on site. He might be 18 to 24. He's probably not open to this stuff. He might not know much about mental health. He probably doesn't talk to people about his feelings, etc. And so we pump out all of this content that's at that level. Now that's really important because there's a huge number of people who are at that point in their journey. Yeah. But there are project managers, there are people in their 50s and 60s, there are senior leaders, there are accountants. Yeah. So I think thinking about the different needs within your business is super important, because otherwise, yes, it's good to shoot down the middle and go, how do we reach the largest number of people with our key messages? But you also need to think creatively about how to engage those harder to reach groups.
Yeah, and sort of leave no one behind,
Yeah.
Particularly on that well-being sort of side of things, and it's really, really important.
An important point about what you said as well is those people who you're not initially targeting as the frontline workers are often the decision makers,
of course,
or hold the budgets. And if you don't get them engaged and don't get them involved, then that won't become an automatic part of their thought process. So safety takes a back seat.
Yes.
Whereas it needs to be at the forefront of decision making.
Yes.
So I'm really interested in your business, because I think one of the challenges is, I often hear this question, do we start at the bottom or do we start at the top? Do we try and achieve this culture change with leaders and hope that it filters down? Or do we start with people at the grassroots who are maybe more receptive to some of these messages, have a bit more capacity, are not as completely overwhelmed by BAU? What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's a bit of both in that, really. You do have to have that impact with your frontline workers, and you do have to provide the tools, the mechanisms, the systems to keep them safe and to prevent them from being injured. But you have to have a top-down message from your senior leadership that says, we support what's going on. I think one of the bigger points is ownership. Who is actually owning safety within your business? And our view is that we are the EHS team. We are the people who are responsible for compliance, but the owners of safety is everybody, from the CEO to the frontline worker.
Yes.
Everybody owns their own safety and that of everybody else. And that's the key message we try to put out. I mean, one of our vision and mission statements, we have our pursue positive beyond zero. So our view is that we want to not just go for zero accidents, we want to actually make people healthier and have a positive impact in people's lives through keeping them safe and healthy, and their mental health and well-being is part of that as well.
I'd be interested in your views. In one of our other episodes, we had Oliver St. Andres from City of London, and he shared some examples of the top down and the bottom up, and felt that both of those are really good strategies, but found this thing in the middle called middle management that often was a derailing factor for a lot of great ideas and initiatives from both angles.
Yeah.
Experiences on that factor from you guys?
Absolutely, it can be. A lot of businesses, our own included, have had the position where people are there to almost say no to things, to prevent things from happening, almost keep the status quo. Our CEO is very keen to ensure that he's telling the business to try things, to don't say no to things, have a go at it. She'll be right, but the idea that if you get it wrong, it doesn't matter. Fail, but fail fast, and move on to the next thing, and try something new. Just because the way you've done something for X number of years doesn't mean it's the right way to do it now. The world's changing around us, technology is changing, systems are changing. We have to adapt, and we have to be open to new technologies and new systems to be able to then help our businesses to go forward. From a safety perspective, we see ourselves as business partners. We're not there. We are a compliance function. We're there to make sure we are complying with our own rules, but we're business partners. We're there to help things to happen, to unlock. Absolutely.
Jehan, from a storytelling application of that, is there some strategies you've seen or deployed yourself that have made a real impact in that middle management kind of layer?
Well, I think one of the key things is that the leaders at the top of the chain are willing to be vulnerable. And it's too easy, I think, for a lot of senior leaders to sort of just palm this off onto the health and safety team. And basically the edict is just make sure people don't die or get injured at work. However you do that, we don't really care. We're going to carry on with all of our stuff. And I think what people want to see is their leaders actually make themselves accessible, speak not only about what the organisation is doing to tackle health and safety, but also their own health and safety experiences. I mean, many leaders, some of course have sat in an office their whole life, but many have ended up in their positions having worked in different parts of the sector. They will have lived experience that they can use to connect. And I think when people see that their leaders have actually experienced some challenges, they've been in environments where there have been injuries or deaths, but they've also seen how things can be done right and how lives can be saved. I think that can be incredibly powerful. But that takes courage.
Oh, absolutely. And you mentioned the word vulnerability there. And one of the interesting reflections so far, there's been some examples at PepsiCo in terms of utilising real world examples and sharing that, the Pike River example, where people have opened up your own storytelling experience, Jehan. What reflections on how critical that vulnerability piece is, and given the broader societal piece of where things are at globally, are we getting better at that, or have we peaked and are we coming backwards on it?
Well, Brené Brown says vulnerability is the first thing I want to see in you and the last thing I want you to see in me. So we can use this word and bandy it around in a business context, but usually we want other people to do it. We don't want to have to be vulnerable ourselves. And I also think that the word vulnerability has almost lost a bit of its meaning as well, because a lot of people think it means that I'm spilling my guts and I'm pouring everything out to you, and I'm oversharing, I'm floodlighting, I'm blurring the boundaries between personal and professional. How do I as a leader maintain the safety around my own leadership without actually sharing too much with the people that I'm around? And of course that's not what it means. I think what we mean by vulnerability in a business context is really showing up as a human.
Real.
And the more that our leaders are able to do that, then the more benefits there will be, because you're demonstrating the culture that you're trying to create for your people.
Yeah, and it's a case of this is my truth. If you are being open and honest with people, and not oversharing, of course, but if you're being honest with people, they see that, and it is more real to them. One of the things we're doing at the moment is, so as part of my fleet safety role, we have a defensive driving program we call Test Drive, which is 10 easy safety tips for defensive driving. And we're trying to go what we're calling test drive testimonials. So we're trying to get real people to give us a paragraph of an event that has happened to them while they're driving for work, and where they see that they could have avoided something had they followed the tips, or more importantly, that they avoided a collision event because they did follow our 10 tips. And those sorts of things resonate with people all over the world. So, in our quarterly newsletter, we will put one of these testimonials in just simply to let everybody else see that one of their colleagues in a completely different part of the world potentially has the same experience as them. And it means something to them.
And probably on multiple levels as well, not just on a safety level, but on a team cohesion and at a corporate brand level. I think one of the things I'm keen to explore more is obviously, PepsiCo is an incredibly marketing-led, brand-led business globally, powerful, everyday brand. Does it apply that same approach from a safety and health, safety and well-being perspective in terms of bringing that type of marketing type storytelling approach into the business from a safety and well-being perspective?
Yeah, well, we mentioned earlier, you can see on my shirt here, we've got it, the Beyond Zero Pursue Positive.
Yep.
From a fleet safety perspective, we were looking at how do we rebrand ourselves to be more current to the business. So what's our little team, part of a global organization, but a small part of that.
Yes.
What are we trying to do to help our people? And we're driving compliance, but we're trying to prevent collisions. So that the strapline for our own team is driving compliance, preventing collisions. They're simple things, but it's trying to put that out there on every piece of information, documentation, whether it's a piece of training, we put it on there so people know that that's what our mission is. We're trying to help everyone to get home safely every day.
Yeah, brilliant. Jehan, from your perspective, war stories in terms of how organisations you've worked with have applied storytelling to transform culture. Reflections on those?
Well, I mean, one of the examples that comes to mind on that leadership piece is I did a piece of work for a major bank in New Zealand, and it was a leadership event for 1,200 of their people leaders across 3 days. And they had a number of new members of their executive, and 5 of those new members chose to share personal stories that had nothing to do with banking and also nothing to do with health and safety or anything that really had significance in the business. But it was things like the breakdown of their marriage, what it was like having a child with a disability, just really personal stuff. And you could hear a pin drop in the room. And the feedback from people was, we have never heard our leaders speak this honestly. And so I think what we do when we share stories like that, especially at a leadership level, is we give people permission. And that's a weird concept because most leaders say, but people already have permission. Have we not been telling them for the last 10 years to be open, to ask for help in a safety context, that it's okay to flag a risk or something that you're concerned about with your manager, all of those key messages. But I think a lot of people are still waiting for that permission. And that's what you do as a leader when you share your own story.
Yeah. Absolutely. One of our key messages at the moment for our teams is to have the courage to care. And it's a really simple thing to say, but it has huge meaning. Have the courage to care for your fellow workers, your teams, your people, your bosses. They have to have the courage to care for you, and you have to have the courage to care for each other. It's a massive thing within our business now, within EHS, which then rolls beyond the EHS teams and into the operational teams and into the sales teams, and it's relevant to everybody. But it's a simple term, but means a lot.
I love the concept around that beyond zero. Not so much, and I'm not a big fan of zero harm, that type of thing, because for lots of different reasons. But what you're really indicating with that kind of philosophy is that it's actually health and safety can be regenerative. We're actually going to add value to people's lives. We're not just going to be focused on stopping something bad from happening to them physically or psychologically. We're actually going to give them a work experience that actually adds value to them as a human being. We're interested in exploring a little bit more about, there's a current paradigm for safety globally pretty well, which is, regulatory driven. Organisations aim up at that to meet that regulatory requirement. Safety professionals, by and large, are developed and expected to help organisations meet those requirements. And most of the technology that gets developed is there to support the safety professionals to help those organisations meet that compliance. And it's very, very deep-seated. It's very much been the approach to safety since post-World War II. Globally, we can see that it's plateaued out in terms of that global harm reduction, in terms of harm getting incurred through work. And we know there's a lot of emerging evidence to support this notion of a culture of safety, which looks at actually what is, in a perfect world, what would my organisation look like, all things considered, and how do we get there from where we currently are. And so the challenge for the safety professional and the safety leader is, how do I engage with my board, my executive, key stakeholders, my audience, to try and stimulate, I suppose, a more modern view of things in order to help me get where I want to go. So really interested in Daniel to give us a bit of an insight on that.
Yeah, I think that the first thing to understand is that many EHS professionals find themselves firefighting,
yes,
as it were, on a daily basis, and it's constantly about dealing with issues.
Yep.
It's a luxury to be able to take that step away from that firefight to say, well, where do I want our organisation to go, and what do we want to achieve, and how do we get there? I think I'm very lucky within PepsiCo that we have the capacity to do that because of our matrixed organisation. Yeah. So we have the local teams who are dealing with everyday safety. We've got our our business unit teams, our sector teams, and then the global team that I'm part of. And we have the opportunity to look at new and emerging technologies to understand how they can help us. What we then have to do is try and find a way that when we've identified something that we believe will work, is to sell that into the board, or sell that into the sector teams, as it were, to let them understand why you want to make a change. We're currently going through a reframe of our management systems and standards, and that was done because we had very technical standards which were slimmed down, but when they got slimmed down, people then didn't really understand exactly what they had to do, so they've asked for more details. So we're sort of trying to find a halfway house. But you then have to ensure that the people you're delivering those systems to understand why you've done that, and what the context of the changes you've made. If you don't have that story to tell them, if you aren't able to explain to them in real terms why you want to do something, then they will struggle to understand it, and the likelihood is they will object to that change. You know, can't we not just keep the status quo? If you do that, you will simply go backwards, because the world moves around you. We're looking at artificial intelligence technologies, and I was chatting to somebody at an event recently, and they were saying we're currently looking at the worst artificial intelligence that we'll ever see, because it's growing and developing so quickly. If we're not looking at what that can develop and deliver for us in the future, then we will miss the boat. So from my perspective, I'm looking at things like telematics. So we've already got in-vehicle telematics, the black box, as it were. We've got camera-based telematics, and with AI and machine learning built in, and that is rolling out across our business. That can tell us an awful lot. What we have to do is to sell the benefits of those technologies into the business, because you will get a lot of people from frontline, drivers included, who will say, well, you're going to be watching me. I haven't got time to watch 80,000 drivers every day for 24 hours. Funnily enough.
Come on, Daniel.
Yeah, I should work harder. But the key for us is that the benefits of having that technology and adopting that can save lives. It can prevent collisions. If we can see that somebody's distracted, we can then give them a message, and we can send them an automated message saying, you're distracted, focus. Or if they're fatigued, you need to pull over. It's an automated message. It's not a conversation, because we don't want to distract them, but the technology allows us to do that in real time. That technology is going to continue to improve. There will be automated vehicles. That gives a whole nother level of challenge, because you'll have automated vehicles on the road with drivers. And for the next 30 years, we're going to see that those automated vehicles are probably going to be much safer than the vehicles with human drivers. But we have to, as a business, because we're running that many vehicles, look at those potential risks, and what do we do to keep our people safe in those situations, and make sure that we sell that to the business, so that they understand that we want to invest in new technologies, considerable amount of investment in many cases, but that will ultimately keep ourselves, our consumers, our customers, our people, and the general public safe. That's a really important thing for us as leaders to do, and as a global business to do.
So that really feels like a lot of that jeopardy factor that we've been talking about, really understanding that audience. What are the things that are going to trigger their interest, their curiosity, perhaps some willingness?
And jeopardy has two sides to the coin. So one side is, if we don't do X, Y, Z, this is the risk, right? This is the consequence. This is what could happen. But the other side of that is, if we find a different way to handle this, if we invest in new technologies, if we collaborate better, if we ask for help, whatever the case may be, things could actually be better. And I think both of those levers can be pulled through the stories that you tell to influence change. Both, we need you to do this stuff because actually bad stuff could happen, but also, if you do this stuff and if you buy in and you work with us on this, then life will be better, we'll be more productive, we'll be more successful as a business, and the well-being of our people will be improved. I mean, what's not to love in that?
That's right. And I think it goes so much further. We sort of obviously covered the regulatory side of things, and obviously the social impact side of things. But I think a lot of maybe safety leaders could do a stronger job of perhaps putting in all of the value creation that comes with what they do in front of that audience, in terms of actually, because we're elevating our culture, we're harming less people, so that's great from probably a regulatory perspective, and it's good from a harm reduction social impact perspective. But actually that's now having an impact on our insurance commercial conversation. So there's a commercial aspect to that. It's having an impact on morale across the team. They've got better relationships, their engagement's going up, they actually want to work here, so our churn rate's reducing down, we're keeping the people that we want to keep in the organisation. Those are all fundamental business value creation attributes.
And you talked about how to bring boards on board with this stuff. I mean, all those things that you've just listed off, that's stuff that boards are interested in. Yeah. And so I think the key point is that culture change can be slow, and quick wins are often not the result of some of what we're talking about. So if you want to shift the culture, you're going to have to tell some of these stories for 2 years, 5 years, maybe even longer, until you see the stats or whatever you're using to measure start to shift. So it does require courageous leadership to say to a health and safety professional, okay, we are going to give you $100,000 to do this, or we're going to back you to do different forms of communication or storytelling or initiatives to try stuff and experiment, and we're going to give you some time to see the effects of that.
And for the safety professional back the other way, it's having that confidence to be able to tell that story and articulate that to the audience that you're talking to around this isn't a quick win, this isn't a piece of technology that we get installed and the outcome's achieved in pretty good order. It's about human beings and attitudes, values and beliefs ultimately, and it can take time, and we may get some wins. It may take longer than we think, but we've got to back ourselves on this journey type thinking.
I think you've also got to accept and be willing to tell the story to those senior leadership teams that they may never actually see the benefit of the work you're doing, because your objective is to prevent harm.
That's right.
Of course.
So if you prevented the collision from happening, you're never going to know whether the technology you invented has actually worked, because it didn't happen.
Yeah.
And if I was able to do that with everything that I was working on from a safety perspective, I'd be fulfilled. But nobody would ever know what I've done.
Yes. Yeah. It's a
and
really
that would be
point.
Perfect. But I think you need to be able to tell that story to people for them to understand that you're not necessarily going to see return on investment from a traditional way that a financial leader might expect.
Yes.
You have to be able to tell them that you're confident, and your figures will show it eventually. Your lost time incident rates or whatever maybe you're measuring, it's days away from work, whatever KPI you're looking at, they will change. That may take time, but you won't necessarily see a financial return on the investment you make. But ultimately, the business will, because you've got people staying in work. You're not having to get replacements. You're not paying for new tools, equipment, people, agencies. All that comes together as a result of the work that we do from a safety perspective, without actually giving that financial return necessarily.
Especially, and that's even amplified even more so in a fleet, because not only have you got people at risk, but a huge amount of plant and equipment, obviously, in terms of vehicles.
Absolutely.
With a huge amount of capital and financial risk tied up in that, right?
Yeah, a huge amount of financial risk from that, but also the fact is that people are more likely to be seriously injured in road traffic collisions than they are in a factory potentially.
Yes.
Construction is probably a slight, and farming, agriculture, there are areas where there is huge risk as well. But occupational drivers are at a huge disadvantage because if they are involved in an event, it's likely to be serious.
Yes.
The risk to them is huge. The vehicles we buy, we look at the best technologies. We look at having even in the small vans, you have your airbags and your adaptive cruise control systems and your lane departure warning systems, and it's then getting people to want to use them. So again, we come back to storytelling. It's coming back. If you give a driver a new vehicle with all the best kit in it, he may not like it because it's not what he's used to.
Yes.
He or she. And we had this going back a few years ago in one business where the vehicles had automatic braking.
Yep.
So if they got too close to the vehicle in front, it slowed itself down.
Yep.
But of course, as truck drivers, they were used to getting as close as they possibly could to other vehicles to then overtake them. So they were giving themselves that bit of slipstream, if you like. But the vehicles kept slowing themselves down, and they hated it. Because what hadn't happened was we hadn't explained to them what it was there to do, why it was there to help them, and they had to adapt the way they drove. Yeah. When they got used to it and they could see the benefit of it, actually they got to like it, because initially they wanted us to turn the system off, and we're not going to turn off a safety system that's there to protect you.
Yes. Yeah.
But it was about, had we gone down that of telling them when they got the new vehicle what it was going to do and explain why, then we wouldn't have had the rejection.
And the most powerful storytellers in a context like that are your own people who are in those roles. So if you can find effectively ambassadors, early adopters, people who you've trained up before you've rolled something like this out to the whole organization, use them to tell the story, because people working on the front line are far more likely to connect with a story that's told from someone who looks like them and is in the same role and is wearing high-vis or the company uniform or whatever the case may be than a health and safety professional.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. What about the importance of, we sort of stopped at jeopardy in that kind of that four kind of step sequence, but what about how important do you think as part of the storytelling piece is celebrating the wins and or losses, whichever way it sort of goes, as part of then recalibrating that story to kind of building more momentum?
Well, I saw a fantastic example in the papers today. Transport for London has been doing some work around reducing suicide on the tube. And they have done some training for their staff around how to intervene in a situation where they think that someone might be at risk. And they do actually have some data on this, which shows that the number of interventions conducted by their staff have doubled. So that's really interesting. Data is good, but we always know that narrative-based communication has more impact emotionally than data. So one of the stories that they've told more recently is about a rail worker who has intervened to prevent 29 deaths since 2015. Imagine one person who's a rail worker, probably not on a huge salary, certainly not in a leadership position or anything fancy, but in the course of his day-to-day work has prevented 29 people from ending their lives. Now, he has received an honour from the government for that, and he has chosen to not only share his experiences through social media, so that's also handing over some of the power to your people and equipping them to tell their own stories using whatever channels are accessible to them. And also picking up some media opportunities to speak about the work that his organisation has been doing. There are so many people, so many untold stories, and also storytellers in our organisations who just need to be identified, in some cases given some training and support around how to share safely and especially in public contexts. But they're there, right? And often we just don't use them.
Yeah, I think celebrating success is incredibly important. It's very easy to talk to the negatives when it comes to safety, because you have had an event, you've had an accident, you've had a collision, you've had something gone wrong. But if you can actually celebrate the successes of people through reducing those number of events and actually share that message within your teams and the broader, our global team, that does have an impact on people. And if you're celebrating the success of a team of people as well, and you can demonstrate to the rest of the business that if they follow these simple guidelines that these others have adopted, they can be the next ones that are in the newsletter or on the email or being talked at in the global town hall. Those sorts of things, a simple thank you sometimes can be as important to an individual as a news article. If a leader, and not necessarily a safety leader, but if a leader comes and says thank you to somebody for a job well done, that can have a huge impact on that individual, because they will go and tell everybody he came and said thank you to me, and they'll go home feeling on the top of the world.
And the thank yous, the surfacing of it, the values, and actually they've recognised something, which is powerful. I mean, we have a client, Heathrow Airport, I think most people are aware of, and they achieved a really really decent reduction in their lost time injury frequency rate over the last 12 or 15 months, like really material reduction. And it'd be fair to say when we first sort of started working there and taking this kind of cultural based approach to safety, there was the normal sort of distribution of people. There was the early adopters, the people that were sort of in behind, ready to go second, and then at the other end of the spectrum, there's a few sort of people sitting back going, well, we're not too sure about this. But what we've found is that being able to read back those wins is incredibly galvanizing for building momentum, for moving more of that distribution curve to the front. So you get the next cohort go, actually, there's enough. I've now seen enough to think, actually, I'm going to step into this because there's value here, and so you start to build that momentum as a result.
The other thing that I would say is that there is a lot of duplication around this stuff in different parts of a business, particularly a large business. So health and safety, well-being perhaps over here, diversity and inclusion, leadership, a lot of this stuff comes back to deeply entrenched narratives that are actually outside the business and in culture. So if we think about health and safety, narratives around masculinity, what does it mean to be a man, a tough, macho, strong man? How does that affect how I show up at work? How does it affect my relationships, what I share, what I don't share? What I've found as someone coming in from the outside into a lot of businesses is that a lot of what your health and safety team is trying to do is actually the same stuff that your wellbeing team, your
Yep.
diversity and inclusion team, your leadership team are trying to do.
Yep.
So I think there can be a lot less resource spent and probably a more coherent
Yep.
narrative that's woven through
Yeah.
all of the internal communications.
Yep.
If you join up with the other teams and say, what are you noticing about the demographics of our workforce? What are some of the challenges that they're facing in their personal life
Yep.
that might be affecting how they're showing up at work? And how do we, if we're going to do something for Mental Health Awareness Week or Men's Health Week or whatever, how do we make sure that we're reinforcing our key messages, not just from that particular portfolio area, but across the business?
100%. And we're saying earlier, Denny, you're reflecting on it. We've seen the sort of the emergence of sort of integrated management systems in the modern sort of era, and which is just recognition that the methodology is very similar, just with obviously the domain knowledge variation across those, but much in the same breath that Jehan's sort of sharing there. Are we pulling that together as an integrated storytelling system as health and safety wellbeing leaders?
Yeah, I think it comes back to what we mentioned earlier on as well about partnerships. So we are business partners. We're partnering with the HR teams, with the wellbeing, with the sustainability teams. If we don't all work together, then you're effectively pulling the business in different ways. You need to be seeing what their key focus is and does it align with your focus, and if not, then you need to get together and actually start to align, because otherwise you're going to challenge the teams who have to implement in different ways. So from a leadership perspective, you have to understand that you have to make sure that you're not asking your business to do something that another team is asking them to do something completely different. You have to have a coherent, cohesive approach. And management systems help with that, but again, there are different management systems for different parts and different functions. So it's about making sure that, again, your objectives of your system align with those of other systems as well.
I think you also need to think really carefully about the volume of communication that people in a modern workplace or modern workforce are facing at the moment. I did an event recently around some leadership storytelling with a business, and the main piece of feedback that came from their people is, can you just tell us what it is that you're wanting us to focus on this month? Because again, sustainability, diversity and inclusion, we're talking about neurodiversity, we're talking about things like menopause in the workplace, we're talking about financial well-being because we know people are under pressure. Then we've got the health and safety. So it's like there needs to be a coherent plan. If you're going to roll out a range of different initiatives and you're going to try and change a bunch of behaviours, if you do all of that at the same time, it's like throwing spaghetti at the wall. People can't actually process it.
So for the safety professional, maybe there's a take out of that in terms of having a good scan across what's actually going on in the business. Are there things that you can weave in the storytelling you're trying to generate from a health, safety, wellbeing perspective into some of those other initiatives that may or may not already be happening?
Absolutely. If you can align your message to an existing message that's coming up from another part of the business, then it reinforces for both parts, both functions, but the people get the same message, and hopefully both will stick.
And from a executive management perspective and a governance perspective, it's also demonstrating a desire to try and get more juice out of the fruit. I know there's sometimes a criticism of safety leaders when they sort of bring initiatives to the table, asking for an investment, and they're a bit of an island, out on their own. So I think being able to just be cognizant of that and actually bring something to the table that is collaborative across an organisation that reflects a bit of thought that's gone into actually using resources efficiently in a tough environment for a lot of businesses.
And I think you have to be mindful of that anyway. Particularly, we talked about technology earlier on. If you're looking at things like AI systems, camera systems, whether they be in a workplace to look at your lockout tagout procedures and ensure people aren't putting themselves in positions of harm, or in a vehicle, you have to understand that you're going to have to get your information security people in. You're going to have to get your IT people. You're going to have to get your GDPR approval. You're going to have to get HR approval. You're going to have finance. You're going to have all of these procurement teams and everybody else engaged with you, because you need them to help you to push this through. And that's before you even put it into the workplace. So you've got to get your ducks in a row first. If you don't, you're never going to succeed. But having that willingness to approach those other functions before you try something, that's where we as safety professionals, safety leaders have to up our game and be proactive. Absolutely.
And I would say that from a storytelling perspective, your internal communications team are your best friends, or they should be. Build proactive relationships with them. Ask them to explain where are the different touch points within the business, what are the channels that they have, not just your intranet and your website, but where are the individual levers across, say, a calendar year that they have to connect with people and with stakeholders. There will be a whole lot of opportunities there that you're not even aware
Tapping
of.
into, yeah.
And what you're wanting to do, quite cynically, is to exploit those and to piggyback on top of existing opportunities. So if your CE has a weekly Zoom call with the company or an email update or whatever, how often across those 52 weeks are your messages being showcased in there? Possibly none, right? So have those conversations.
Great practical take-up. That's great. So we heard from Jehan earlier about the two sides of the jeopardy coin, and one of those sides being, how difficult it can be sometimes to try and tell a story and paint a picture about something that hasn't been created yet. What are some of the practical takeouts, I suppose, from a safety professional, a safety leader, to try and start to stimulate that movement in an organisation?
Yeah, I think it's always been fairly easy to look at what's happened. You have your KPIs you mentioned earlier on. You have your results. They can tell you the number of collisions or the number of events, number of incidents, lost time injuries. All of that data is there. Lagging indicators tell you what you've done. When you want to move forward, you want leading indicators. You want to look at information that's going to tell you how you're preventing those from happening. So it could be on training. How many health and safety hours of training have you done for each individual that could have prevented an event or an incident? Those sorts of things. It's understanding your business and understanding what leading indicators you may be able to pull out to then present to the leadership team that says to them, here's the positive work that we're doing to ensure we don't have those lagging indicators going forward. That's a huge challenge for people, because it's changing the way you think as a safety professional and moving away from the firefighting, moving away from the reactive work to the proactive, preventative work.
Yeah, and that's obviously where the industry needs to go over time, and I think that's a real challenge for the industry, because it's so hardwired into that traditional lag mentality. Everyone measures what goes over the cliff, but not many people look at how well was the fence at the top of the cliff built in the first place. And as a result of strengthening that fence, what impact did that make? And actually look at that. A whole lot more things are going right because we've got a bit of a line of sight on those attributes that actually prevent those things from happening.
Absolutely.
Do you have a comment on that as well?
Yeah, I would use an example from rugby. So I've done a lot of stories over the years on concussions, and this is a major issue in New Zealand and around the world. Young people, particularly men, getting serious head injuries that are totally affecting their life going forward, and also getting physical injuries, rendering them tetraplegics or paraplegics as a result. So the traditional way to tell that story is, here's a bunch of people who've been harmed. Here's how they've dealt with it. Here's how it's affected their life. And those are, as we've talked about extensively, positive stories that can make people aware of risks, for example. But at the end of the day, thousands of people are going to play rugby, right, each weekend. So how do we tell different stories, more creative stories that are still helping to change the culture? So some of the other stories that I've told have been about the concussion researchers and the journeys that they've been on to delve into a topic that is still quite taboo and people don't want to talk about. What about the rugby board? How are they thinking differently about the rules and how we can actually play the game to make it safer? What are we seeing overseas? In New Zealand, we're seeing that the bodies have got larger over the years. The hits are getting bigger. How do we actually adapt the way that we play rugby? So the point that I'm making is, the only story is not the harm story. This is the person who was injured. Let's just not do that again. There are a lot of other aspects or angles to any health and safety issue that you can use. And it does require a bit of creativity and thinking outside the box, but it will give you a lot more narrative material for you to use rather than simply focusing on those one-dimensional stories.
All right, so into the last segment of today's session. It's been awesome having you both on the segment today, and it's a great conversation and some really practical takeouts for our listeners out there. So the first of our quickfire questions is, who's been the most inspirational leader from a storytelling perspective that you've noticed that's just had an impact on you and made a difference out there?
Okay, quite happy to go first on this. And I've been very lucky that I've worked with a lot of really charismatic and inspiring leaders in my career, both within PepsiCo and beforehand. And I think some of the people that I've met as a result of the work I've been doing, I've been very lucky. A gentleman, Andrew Sharman, you may know of. He is such a charismatic speaker. I remember some of the sessions that I've been in when he's talked about his hobbies outside of work, which are quite contrary to what you would consider from a safety professional's perspective: shark diving and riding motorbikes in the mountains. That resonated with me because I love mountain biking, I love cycling, I love those types of activities which people may consider to be unsafe. But one of the people who very, very recently inspired me was even just last night. I was at my son's football. I'm a volunteer coach with the team, and I was running the line. And the referee last night, dealing with 14-year-old boys, was so good at explaining his decision making and keeping the game flowing and making sure that there was no misunderstanding, and just his ability to communicate at the right level with those boys was fantastic. And it really struck me that he had got his game completely right from a refereeing
Had
perspective.
his narrative right and his tone, and I'm sure there's a few 14-year-old boys that had an opinion or two that they wanted to
Absolutely,
express.
yes. And some of them didn't agree with him, but it was done respectfully because he explained to them and he was at the right level.
There's a saying I once heard from a leader in the sporting industry, which was, it's not about agreement, it's about respect. And that's a really important position, I think, for people like, especially referees. You're never going to agree with them all the time, but as long as you can respect the process and live with it, move on. Jehan?
The most inspiring leader would be whoever the last person is that I've interviewed, because I think too often we think of leaders as people who are at the top of a hierarchy or top of the tree, but actually it takes leadership and it takes courage to open up about whatever your lived experience is, especially with a large audience. So I'm always inspired by people who choose to share what they've been through to educate others.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I mean, a lot of the most powerful and inspiring stories that get told, they're not from
People with
heads of
titles.
state or heads of royalty or whatever it might be. They're people that you sit next to on the tube, or whatever it may be, or find yourself sitting next to on a long haul flight into the southern hemisphere or vice versa, and start having a bit of a chat with, and you get to start to hear about their story. And some of those, I agree, are some of those inspiring things that sit with you for a very long time. So
in New Zealand, we talk about stories as taonga, which is the Māori word for treasure or gift. And so when someone shares their story with you, they are actually giving you a treasure. They're giving you part of themselves. So I think it's important that we respect that.
Yeah, great perspective. All right, second quickfire question. What's the most confronting but impactful suggestion for how business leaders could leverage storytelling to improve safety culture?
Most confronting, that's a challenging one. I think that not knowing what you're trying to achieve is going to be the most challenging thing you will come across. If you don't know what you want and you try to put in a new idea, a new technology, whatever it may be, you will not get the respect of the business. So it's trying to get the respect from really knowing the business cold. Understand the business, understand what you want, and then how it will improve the business going forward. If you don't do that, you will not get the respect of the people you're trying to sell the idea to.
Yep. And most critically, you're not going to achieve the outcome that you're trying to achieve in terms of harm reduction or the improvement in culture or whatever it may be. So
Absolutely.
Do your homework, know your stuff, go in armed rather than unprepared. Good advice.
2 words: get personal.
Yep.
And the reason that's confronting is because a lot of leaders don't like to get personal. They don't like to get vulnerable, as we've already talked about, but it is the game changer. It's the most important thing that you can do to actually engage with people on a more human and a more personal level. And whether that is on a stage at your staff conference, or whether it's something as small as a LinkedIn post where you share something from your own life or a challenge that you've been through, you are contributing to the change in culture that we've talked about.
Yeah, and when we've seen it in our business, as I've probably got better at being able to share my own experience with our team as we're sort of growing up as a business over the last 8 years, as coming through from a surf lifesaving perspective as a volunteer and having a few interesting experiences as a very young lifesaver, both good and bad. Ultimately, probably all good. But then how that sort of inspired ultimately the creation of Safe 365, and really trying to drive this proactive risk management culture in organisations to try and unlock a whole lot of harm reduction. And I think the more I've probably understood that myself and started to share that with more people, the more galvanising it's become for our business to increase the impact we're having out there for the clients we work with, and the more people want to come and work with us, and so on and so forth. So that's my lived experience of exactly what you're talking about. All right, what do you think the most critical the most critical ingredient is if you wanted to start to foster a proactive safety culture in an organisation? You're a safety professional sitting in there in a leadership role, thinking, how do I get started? What's the most critical ingredient that I need to get in place here to start to move this thing in a positive direction?
I think honesty.
Yeah.
I think you have to be honest with yourself. You have to be honest with your business. People have to see your honesty, because if they don't believe you,
They won't support you.
they won't support you.
Yeah, great.
I'd say influence.
Yep.
If you aren't able to influence people's thoughts, their feelings, their behavior, then you're going to struggle to achieve whatever it is that you're trying to achieve in your role.
Yep.
So thinking about how you can use the tools that we've talked about today to gain influence over how people think and feel.
So influence and honesty, a couple of pretty critical ingredients I'd suggest to getting things moving in the right direction. Last question. What's the best advice you would give to a safety professional looking to stimulate and grow a culture of proactive safety in their business?
I think you need to understand what the culture of the business is. You need to understand what you want to achieve. So from our perspective, safety culture is it's the way we do things.
Yep.
It's as simple as that.
Yep.
You know, you need to go in and you need to say to the business, the way we want to do things is this. That's what we want to get to.
Yep.
So really understand what you want to achieve and then don't give up.
Yeah.
You know, you will get knockbacks. Just
Yep.
don't give up.
If it was easy, everyone would have already done it. Right?
Absolutely.
Good answer.
Recognize what you don't know
Yep.
in this space. I hate the term soft skills, but really what we're talking about here, communication, empathy, influence, these don't necessarily come naturally to a lot of people, especially those from more technical or academic backgrounds. So if this is stuff that you're uncomfortable with or you don't know a lot about, you don't see yourself as a storyteller or an influencer, you don't have a LinkedIn profile, you don't do this type of stuff, stretch the muscle, stretch the storytelling muscle. And so I'm fortunate to go into businesses and do training around the things that we've talked about. Look for someone in your area who can give you some of those tools, because it will make you more confident. It will take away a lot of the stress, and I think you'll see some of the results that we've talked about.
Yeah, I mean, just building on that, I think that's spot on. I mean, for me, it's self-awareness. You know, if you have a really good understanding of yourself, and through that you have a really good understanding of how other people around you interact with you and why, then that's an incredibly powerful position to be in, to be able to then, you know, have influence and start to, you know, get things moving in the right direction. So don't be shy about learning about yourself. I think that's really important.
And don't be afraid to be wrong.
Yeah.
You know, we all make mistakes. We all get things wrong. Sometimes the direction we want to move in isn't the right direction at the right time for an organization. But learn from the people who are challenging you. Be prepared to be challenged and be prepared to accept that there may be a better way.
Yeah, awesome. All right, guys. Daniel, Jehan, we've been super lucky to have you guys come in and have the session with us today. There's been some great wisdom and some great war stories shared in today's Art of Safety Leadership session. So thanks very much. I'm sure our listeners out there, there's some really good practical takeouts that people will be able to take away and apply in their roles as safety professionals and safety leaders. So thanks very much on behalf of everyone out there.
Well, thank you for having us.